All right, today we're jumping into a technology that sounds a little like sci-fi, but it could seriously change how we do, well, just about everything. We're talking about smart contracts. This isn't code that just sits on a server somewhere. This is code that actually acts on its own. Let's get right into it. So just imagine for a second, what if a contract didn't need lawyers or courts? What if an agreement could just enforce itself? That's the huge idea, the core question that smart contracts are trying to answer. So, before we get all tangled up in how they work, let's just make sure we're on the same page. What is the big idea here? What is a smart contract, really? And you know, what's wild is that this isn't some brand new idea. A computer scientist named Nick Szabo came up with this concept way back in 1994. He called it a computerized transaction protocol that executes the terms of a contract. You know, basically a way to turn the words of an agreement into code that runs all by itself. The best way to think about it is like a digital vending machine. It's a perfect analogy. You put in your money, that's condition one. You select your snack, that's condition two, and boom, the machine automatically gives you your item. There's no person you have to talk to, no haggling. The rules are just built right into the machine. That's a smart contract. So why do this? Well, the goals are pretty ambitious. You want agreements that enforce their own rules, which cuts down on both mistakes and people trying to cheat the system. And if you can do that, you don't need to rely so much on trusted middlemen like banks or lawyers. And that, in turn, could seriously lower the costs that come from things like fraud and legal battles. Okay, that all sounds fantastic in theory, but how do you actually make it happen? Well, the secret sauce, the engine that makes all this run, is a technology that wasn't around back in 1994. And here it is. The key piece of the puzzle is the blockchain. The idea of smart contracts had to wait for decades for the right environment to come along, and that environment is a blockchain. The blockchain is basically the perfect home for them. A smart contract is just a little bit of code stored on this public shared database. It gets its own unique address. You can think of it like a digital PO box. When someone sends a transaction to that address, it triggers the code. And because the whole thing is decentralized, copied and run on thousands of computers, it runs the exact same way for everyone. It's verifiable, and it's pretty much unstoppable. All right, let's make this real. Enough with the theory. The best way to really get it is to walk through a super simple example of a trade. Let's meet Bob and Alice. Bob's got some digital assets, and he wants to set up a way to trade them without having to go through a big company or exchange. He wants to build his own little automated trading post that nobody controls. So Bob writes a smart contract with three basic rules or functions. One, a deposit function, so he and only he can put assets in. Two, a trade function that says, hey, I'll swap 5 units of asset Y for 1 unit of asset X with absolutely anyone. And three, a withdraw function, again, just for him to pull out whatever's left in the contract. Okay, step one. Bob releases his contract onto the blockchain. Then, he uses that deposit function to put 3 units of his asset, let's call it asset X, into the contract's care. Everyone on the network can now see that this happened. Now, here comes Alice. She sees Bob's contract out there and thinks, hey, that's a good deal. So she sends 10 units of her asset, we'll call it Y, to the contract's address. The contract instantly wakes up, sees the 10Y, and follows its rule, 5Y for 1X. So it automatically sends 2 units of X right back to Alice's account. No one had to click approve, it just happened. And finally, Bob checks in and sees the trade went through. He uses his private withdraw function, and the contract sends him everything inside. The 10 units of Y that Alice sent, plus the 1 unit of X that was left over. The whole exchange is done. No middleman, no fees, just code. So that little trade gives you a taste of the power here. Let's zoom out now and look at why this is so much more than just a neat trick. Why does this really matter? It comes down to 3 huge properties. First, they are deterministic. That's a fancy way of saying the same input will give you the exact same output every single time. No surprises. Second, they're transparent. Anyone can go and read the code on the blockchain to see exactly what the rules are. And third, they're autonomous. They can hold onto money and other assets and act on their own, like a digital robot following its programming. And when you put those 3 things together, the potential applications are just mind-boggling. We're talking about things like automated escrow for buying a house, marketplaces that aren't owned by anyone, or systems that could automatically pay a musician a fraction of a cent every single time their song gets streamed. And you can take this even further. You can build entire organizations that are run by a collection of smart contracts. They're called DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. Think of them like a company with no CEO, no board of directors, just rules written in code that everyone agrees to follow. But, and this is a big but, as exciting as all this sounds, we need a reality check. This technology is still young, and it has some very, very real challenges to overcome. Here's probably the biggest hurdle of all. Turning a legal contract, which is often full of nuance and flexible language, into perfectly logical, rigid computer code is incredibly hard. Code is black and white. There's no room for interpretation. And if you make one tiny mistake, one little bug, it can lead to disaster because that code is going to run no matter what. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, look at this. This isn't even the code itself. This is just a map, a diagram of the logic for a single, pretty simple license agreement. You can see how fast it just explodes into a tangled mess of possibilities. Imagine trying to get that perfect. Which, of course, brings us to the elephant in the room. You know, if you make an agreement with a smart contract and something goes wrong, can you take it to court? Is any of this actually legally binding? And the simple answer right now is not really. The law is still playing catch up. Blockchains are global, but laws are national. Figuring out how to get our existing legal systems to recognize a piece of code as a valid contract is a massive, complicated debate that's happening right now. And all of this leaves us with one last huge question to think about. In a future where more and more of our agreements are automated by smart contracts, power shifts. It shifts away from the people who interpret the law, like judges and lawyers, and toward the people who write the code. So if code becomes law, who do we want writing the code?